This is the Am I Okay podcast. The reason why rest and recovery is so important is that I think the Am I Okay aspect is probably a small portion, or there is probably a big portion of people that are quite lazy and don't have a drive or don't have a motivation in what they're doing. And I think it's probably easy to say that that's not a good thing. I've experienced it in the past and still sometimes to this day still have my lazy moments. I have these moments where I'm just like all out of things. But then I also have these moments of like all in, all the time. And I have to be doing something, I have to be busy. And I think we forget the idea of the recovery required to do things. That we feel like we need to be doing something all the time to feel productive. That the recovery and the rest is just as important as the ability to take on load and take on stress. So I think naturally most people know from a physiological standpoint that you can't be running 24/7 all the time. Your body needs to sleep, to rest, to recover. And in really extreme situations, such as like ultra marathons, you can work on very little amounts of sleep and rest in order to be able to create this big outlay, but you got to rest before and rest after. Some people need more or less rest after a big race, even a marathon, even after you go to the gym and lift weights. There is this thing called, rests between sets. And the bigger the rest you are, the more weight you can lift next time for your body to recover its systems to be able to go again. And I think physiologically, we are quite aware, and the science backs this up a lot around the ability to recover from sets. Even from running, doing sprints, I'd often jog for a little bit as opposed to just stopping and letting the body recover from what was happening. And we forget our ability to rest and recover through emotional stresses. Earlier in the year, I was running 100K weeks, multiple week after week for the first time ever. The thing was, I wasn't working. I was made redundant for 4 months of that time. And I'm curious to think how much I had the ability to take on that amount of physical stress in that period of time if I was working full time. Because it's easy to determine from a weights, from a sport, from a running perspective, just how much loading your body is going through, and to slowly build up the loading over time, your capacity to do load, and how quickly your body can recover from the load that it's been given. But there's nothing from a work perspective. There's nothing from a family emotional perspective, from a friend's emotional perspective, from a soul and spiritual side of things, of like when you're all out of energy on a concept, to all different areas of your life, that sometimes we actually need that recovery point. We forget around how much stress we've actually taken on and how much stress we're prepared to take on from a metric. If someone goes from not running to running a marathon, there's a massive load physically on the body, no matter how fit you are, that your body isn't used to. And we forget about that from an emotional stress standpoint. I do say all this because this is my current theory of how I try to understand the emotional loading and the anxiety and the situations and the doubt that I experience every day. That a kind of belief that I have around, say, the idea of like PTSD, and this is just only my opinion. This is completely my opinion based off of personal experiences and different people I've talked to over my time, is that when you experience something to that extreme level, is that your body is stressed over the amount that it's capable of loading itself with. Like if you go to war, your body isn't prepared to be in that war zone all the time. It's not adapted to it. And so it's like bending a metal rod as such, so that you bend it so much that it actually deforms past its like breaking point. And so that, I think, happens with your emotions. And I believe that from that, and physically what happens, we do have a capacity to build, we do have the ability to build our capacity from an emotional standpoint, from an ability to deal with stressful emotional situations. However, there's only a certain limit to how much we can actually take on. And I don't think we take on or we know about this as much. A lot of the activity trackers and Whoop, for example, and Aura Rings and all that other stuff is trying to understand your heart rate variability, and all this stuff to understand what stress your body's actually going through physiologically. But we don't actually take on the effects of the emotional stresses that are happening. For example, if someone in your family passes away, if you go through a relationship breakup, if you're going through a difficult time with friends. Because what happens is that, my understanding is that when we have an emotion, these emotions trigger a chemical reaction of all the different things. There's like dopamine, adrenaline, I think there's like two other ones. They'll come to me if they happen. But there are these chemical triggers that happen when we feel certain things. And so when we are under a stressful situation, our body produces these chemicals to help us adjust to that, which is the physiological response of our body to deal with and cope with that amount of stuff. My reason for this is I think we are starting to become a lot more aware. There's awareness, but we don't really implement well the physiological ability of stresses in our world on two extremes. There's a lot of people that are incredibly lazy and unmotivated to go out and go to the gym and to run and to want to exercise. And I'm not saying that you have to have this ability to do it, but I feel like everyone has this capacity to go and find some sort of exercise that they enjoy or that they want to do at least 3 or 4 times a week for nothing else but your health, like an F45, worst case scenario, just to get your body moving, your blood pumping. We're getting to this point of the laziness epidemic of, I think it's becoming a more and more overweight population, to like this alternate extreme now that is slowly seeping in through social media of the extreme ultra endurance sports athlete mindset, where you're pushing your body to the absolute limitations that is also forcing people into hospitals, into serious injuries like stress fractures, rhabdo, all these types of things that we think that we can keep pushing the limit, and you do have to break your limitations to push past your limitations. But to try and find this sustainable balance of potential from a physiological and emotional standpoint, which comes from all these different aspects. This has been an absolute chaotic understanding. But the takeaways from what I'm saying is that the load and the stresses physiologically also have an emotional stress. The emotional stress, I believe, comes from chemical being let off in your body as a result of the emotional stresses that happen, as well as our physiological stresses. That loading is the same as your physical gym, running, any sort of physical loading, that you've got to slowly build that over time. And probably the one thing that you can control a little bit more about the physical stress opposed to emotional stress is that you don't actually have to physically put yourself in crazy situations like marathons without training for them. Whereas sometimes emotionally big things happen to you without your control over them. Or they build up over time without you realizing the slow and continual build up. And so we've got to be aware of how much loading we have, as well as our capacity to deal with it. Someone that's been running for 5 or 6 years has a capacity to deal with a greater load of running than someone that's been running for 3 or 4 months. And I believe it's no different from an emotional standpoint, that if you've put yourself in uncomfortable situations purposely, intentionally, you create a higher capacity to deal with anxiety and stress. For me, that was like going to Vietnam, and I was like in so much shock, doubt, anxiety when I got there. But the frameworks that I used to kind of calm that anxiety a little bit and just accept the way things are allow me to process that uncomfortability more and sit in that uncomfortable situation and adapt quicker to what was going on. And when you're chosen to put yourself in that situation, it allows you to, when something out of your control, like being made redundant a year and a half, it allows you to adapt a lot more quickly from it. And so not only do you have a higher, over time you build a higher emotional capacity, then you also have this ability to need to kind of recover from that capacity and load build up to sort of remove and create a bit of space. That recovery is incredibly important, that if you talk about this physiological recovery, that you also need this emotional recovery point, or like a safe place or a safe people to come back to. So that the emotional stresses of work aren't a full-time feeling, and that I'll just take on more, I'll do more. I'm not saying that you can't stress your body and you can't push your potential. What I'm saying is there's a sustainable approach that I don't believe a lot of people take, and I didn't take for a while, in terms of slowly building up your capacity to stress yourself, as opposed to not doing anything out of the same fear, same worry, the same anxieties about the world and who you are and who you fit into it. But what you'll find is that the same doubts, anxieties, and fears are also probably seen in the people that exercise way too much, extremely, over the top, because they're trying to cope with something. Both extremes are trying to cope. There are different behaviours to cope with the same emotional stresses, for the most part. And so you've got to find this ability to come back to find a different way to cope that allows you to not have to be in the extremes. It's no different to myself, who eats a lot to try and cope with those feelings, whereas other people can't eat at all to cope with the exact same feelings. I think the ability also, I'll add on this point and finish here, is that your ability to, I have a strong belief with your ability to deal with emotional stresses comes from this idea of reducing the amount of things that you use to disassociate and use to hide and to cope with the emotional stresses. For example, smoking, vaping, alcohol, music when you run, eating, drinking, obviously, I think I've already said that, over talking, going to yourself. Everyone has a massive list of coping mechanisms: over exercise, not exercising, to name a few. And it's the ability to not sit and use those coping mechanisms all the time and to see those behaviors. That the actual ability to deal with the emotional stresses is to sit in that uncomfortability, to start letting go of that coping mechanism. And I know in Australia and a lot of the world that drinking is probably the most common one, that even though you might like the taste and you might like how it feels, I have this internal belief that a lot of people do it to try and cope with the reality, to cope with the inability to sit with people and just have a conversation, that they need some sort of social lubricant to be able to have a conversation, to be able to socialize, that they're not confident to sit in their own ability to feel uncomfortable, to say something wrong, to put themselves out there, to be vulnerable, as just one example. And so one thing I've tried to work on so much is to not drink. For 15 months I haven't drunk at all. It was only after the marathon that I had a few drinks, and in Vietnam I had a couple of shots. But it was like maximum 2 on a day. And it's nowhere near enough to have to reduce your coping mechanism. And so the way I say it is, the reduction in alcohol shows myself that I have this ability to trust my ability to be in any situation and dance and try and be fun and try and put myself out there, without trying to use something else externally to cope with what's going on. I'll leave it there. This is a blubbering mess on recovery and stress and how to cope with the emotional aspects of the world. I'm hoping to maybe record something like this again that is more refined as I see things. Because I see a lot of people that aren't okay that use a lot of coping strategies to recover and to recuperate themselves. That could, like going to the gym, build that muscle. I'd be curious to know whether it's in the comments or to send a personal message is, are you aware of some sort of coping mechanism that you currently have to deal with that anxiety, the doubt, the uncomfortability, the lack of confidence in an area of your life, or to deal with an excessive amount of emotions? There could be, and I'd be quite confident there'd be multiple areas in multiple aspects. But if you're at least aware of it, you don't have to actually change it, but at least you can start thinking about whether or not it's something that you want to change or not. Peace.